Thanks for listening to the Granite List Live. Today's episode is brought to you by Connect Healthcare Collaboration, where benefits marketing meets clinical advocacy to drive effective employee engagement.
I'm your host, Lee Dill, and today we're talking about a topic so fascinating to me that is truly changing the world of medicine and improving patient outcomes. I'm pleased to be joined by Anthony Hartley, co-founder and CEO at MedAdvisor. Anthony, thanks so much for being on the show today. I'd love to know what inspired the creation of MedAdvisor. Can you give us a little background?
Yeah, so it goes back to when I was working, thank you for having me, by the way. It goes back to when I was working at a lab that was doing clinical trials, and this was in Switzerland. So after working there for years, I returned to my hometown of Atlanta, and it was great because I got to be involved in so many projects and I got to see so much science. And as you can appreciate with a clinical trial, this is where the initial compound, the initial idea is tested to see if eventually it goes beyond those three phases of the clinical trials to eventually be approved as a therapy for patients. And seeing so many different projects, so many different studies, one of the insights that I recall vividly is how there were some studies that were based not on a prescription, a pill, a medication, but on cell biology. So it was a different type of mechanism of action, we would say. And years later, continuing to work in healthcare, I thought, there isn't enough emphasis on this here in the US. There isn't enough of these therapies getting to patients. So let's see what we can do to bring that to more patients. Because what we saw from the science were just so many advantages. And so I thought, okay, there's got to be a way we can do this, even if we're not one of these large biotech companies that have deep pockets. I thought there's got to be a way that we can get this to more patients.
Right. And MedAdvisor was founded as a patient advocate, and it's educating these employees on a different way to receive medicine. Is that correct?
Yeah, this is a whole area of therapies that are unfamiliar to a lot of patients that would benefit the most. So initially we thought, okay, how can we get this to more patients? And we realized there's so much education we need to do. And then adding to that is the care navigation, because we often talk to patients and they have no idea. And sometimes, surprisingly, practitioners, healthcare workers, it hasn't been introduced in their training. And yet sometimes it's even, a family member or someone close that has a particular condition that could be alleviated quite a lot with these kind of therapies instead of, in some cases, a specialty medication, which is often really expensive.
Right. And you're working a lot with these autoimmune disorders that can go down a road of just constant medication. And so you're trying to offer them an alternative treatment. Can you walk us through what a member journey might look like engaging with your solution?
Yeah. So at the beginning, one of the things we want to do is analyze the claims data as much as it can be available. And sometimes it's a subset. It's not all the claims data. And then beyond that, the next step is for us to educate the employer and the employees through a series of different things. So it can be talks like this. We have a lot of videos we create and we continue to create that are very specific and very patient-centric, so they can understand better, okay, why is this something that I should consider? And eventually then we lead them to a clinic so that they know, here's some options for me. And ultimately, the patient needs to decide, he or she, if that's what they want to do. But ideally, when it's with the self-insured employers, there are different ways that those self-insured employers can make this available to their employees. So this is what we do. And what we found is that the best way is, if we're not able to directly engage with self-insured employers, it's by collaborating with independent advisors, the kind that we often find here on the Granite List. It's by collaborating with them that we can reach those employers. And there's just so many benefits once they start to see how their employees are after the treatment.
You mentioned that there's a couple different ways that you can engage with these self-funded employers. Can you give a couple examples or the most popular? I know you mentioned brokers, but is this part of the plan design that's put in and network contracting? How does that work?
Yeah, it's something where what can happen is, depending upon what is the preference of the employer and the broker, it's just something that could be an add-on. So it can be a separate contract where it's, okay, here's something else that we can consider. And usually the best way is if there's clear understanding with the advisor and the employer so that the individual employee, the patient, is incentivized to be able to choose different things that may be beneficial to them. So not having the copays and the deductibles and these kind of things. And this is where the patient then can decide, okay, well, here's the different things that are presented to me about this therapy and this other alternative. And ideally, then they choose one that is going to be best for their own life, because sometimes it's going to be very different from one patient to another.
Mm-hmm. And having those carrots in place is always beneficial to move the needle a little bit farther in your direction. And patient outcomes, they don't realize it until they get there. But if you can push them a little bit further with financial incentives.
Yeah. I mean, what we find so often is most of the patients are skeptical, right? Because they haven't heard about this as much as they've heard about other options. And usually it's when they hear from someone who has an individual story. So it could be their relative, a neighbor, somebody. And it's very similar, the response from the patients after their therapy, because it's so dramatic, the improvement, that usually they tell everybody they know. So a lot of it has been word of mouth. And I've been in presentations where I'm talking to a group, and then at one point somebody realizes that I'm not talking about other types of therapies, other types of medicine. I can tell you a number of times where somebody says, oh, I had that, or my relative had that. And that's amazing because they really do have such a dramatic improvement. It's very reassuring when that happens.
Do you have a story you can tell us, one of your favorites that might come to mind?
There's a number of them. There's one where the patient had, this is a complex case, but the patient had a combination of an orthopedic condition, but that's also an autoimmune condition. Well, this patient had, I think, 5 surgeries on the same knee.
Wow.
And that person wasn't really improving enough, right? So eventually that patient got to a clinic that offered regenerative medicine specifically for that condition. And so what happened is the patient improved. So eventually later, after talking to, I think, the family physician or the orthopedic physician attending them, who had probably been involved with the surgeries or recommended the surgeries, that physician was surprised at the outcome. And so when that patient was talking with the doctor said something like, well, if your condition changes, if all of a sudden it gets worse, we're not going to do surgery number 6. And it's interesting because we've seen a number of different examples where the patients will try different things, and usually these therapies will show an improvement where others have not.
Well, that's great. And those word of mouth testimonials as well are just great to share, within an organization to get that traction that you're looking for. The outcomes speak for themselves, obviously, as far as patient satisfaction. Do you have any financial stories or case studies that you can share of the financial impact on an organization?
Yeah, this was a group that was, in total, it was 15 patients with rheumatoid arthritis. So we helped these patients go to one of these partnering clinics that was specializing in these therapies, and all of them saw improvement. And they also were able to decrease and in some cases eliminate their specialty medications. One of the other outcomes for those 15 patients, including their health outcome being improved, when you get this type of therapy, you might not need anything else for years. So when you see, okay, this person's improved after maybe just 1 or 2 clinic visits versus continuing on the specialty medication with no end in sight, the dramatic difference in the cost. I mean, we're talking the regenerative therapy is a fraction of the cost, and yet they also are improving their health. So there's more than one strong reason to choose this. Imagine they have the choice, okay, I'm going to go get stem cell therapy for, let's say, rheumatoid arthritis. And here's the cost. And if it's not a clinic nearby, okay, maybe there's some travel cost. But that health outcome is much better than the specialty medication. And they might see that for years. Now then you contrast that choice B with, okay, continuing with a specialty medication where they might not see an improvement, but the cost is 4 or 5 times more. And there's no end in sight because they might just have to continue with that. And so there's 2 strong reasons. The health outcome for the patient is better and the cost is significantly less. So I think the more self-insured employers understand that that's an option, and when they see the results, I think most of them are going to say, oh, yes, we want to make this available. Another advantage is then, well, the recovery. That patient recovers usually within days or weeks, but not several months. in many ways, it's one of these things that it's been hidden in plain sight.
Well, and who knows what kind of effects that these medications, the side effects of some of these medications that they're on, and educate some of us that really don't know how this works. So you're telling me that if I have an autoimmune disorder and I'm taking a number of specialty medications to treat it, I can go to one of your clinics once or twice, receive regenerative medicine, and I'm good to go. Is that how that works? Can you help explain that a little bit for me?
Yeah, let me clarify. So these are clinics we partner with. They're not our clinics. We don't own them.
Okay.
They're independent.
Okay.
What often happens is the patients, when they go for this type of treatment, there is an improvement. There's usually not side effects. The worst thing that could happen is that there's no improvement, but it's still something that they should consider. Now, what we've seen is, in general, there's not side effects to this. And part of that has to do with just the way it works in the body compared to a pill, because it's based on cell biology. So it's not like a pill where it has to go through our system and eventually it can impact our kidneys or our liver. And there's a lot more around the mechanism of action that I could give it a long explanation, but ultimately you can see a difference for the patient that's usually positive versus if they continued with the medication. Now, some patients, well, they don't see that dramatic improvement. So we try to be as clear as we can with the patient, and so does the practicing physicians. We don't want them to think that, okay, it's a miracle. Once you get your clinic visit, everything's going to be spectacular and you'll have a new life. And we don't want them to think that. It's better for us to underpromise and overdeliver. And I think the physicians would say something similar, because usually it's patients that they've had such a difficult time with these conditions. And most of the time they do get better, but sometimes there's not a change. And unfortunately, one of the reasons might be that delay in care, the delay in the diagnosis. So like with other conditions, the sooner they can get this type of care, then the higher probability of getting the outcome that they prefer, which is to be healthy again and to have a normal life.
And so the goal is the education that your solution exists earlier on in the diagnosis so that you can get those employees over to the clinics as soon as possible.
Yeah. And another advantage, and this is, I think, particularly important for the patients and their employers, is that if the care is delayed in some cases, that really can be detrimental to the care journey for the patient. So one of the advantages is that we're able to get them seen by one of these teams sooner, and that can make a big difference. I mean, so often what happens is a typical patient, when they get the first diagnosis from their family physician, before they're referred to the rheumatologist or when they're being referred, it can be several months before they get that first appointment with a rheumatologist. Mm-hmm. So you can imagine how that patient feels and their struggle before they even know, what can I do? How am I going to get better? And all these questions that are quite personal and heartbreaking.
So how quickly can these members be seen in your clinics? Once they're diagnosed, what's the wait time typically?
It can be days or weeks, hopefully not more than that.
Right. Okay. So it kind of sounds like a no-brainer to bring in your solution, right? To at least try. There's no negative side effects. It might not work, but the good chance that it will. Give it a shot. Can you share some misconceptions or, what would you answer to somebody say, I'm really just not sure?
Yeah. I mean, this is the thing. For some people, it sounds like it's too good to be true. And because it's so unfamiliar to most people, they think that, it can't possibly work. And one of the things that we would say is that, well, it's kind of like other things, if we're talking about, okay, what's the difference between, and I know that this is familiar to a lot of people on the granite list. If we make a comparison between, okay, what can an employer expect if they're self-insured versus fully insured? There's a big difference, right? And one of the differences is that they can actually see the data, usually, or hopefully a good amount of it. They have more autonomy. And then they can basically, with their advisor, they can create a plan that's best for their employees, right? And so there's so many advantages once they make that step. But a lot of employers somehow, they haven't done it. And there's a number of reasons for that. But I think most of the advisors that we know that have guided or continue to guide employers to be more self-insured understand that there's more benefits than downsides. Mm-hmm. And what I think happens in this space is that because of the awareness for a lot of people, there's the perception maybe that, well, if it's a medical condition, that there's probably a pill that I'll be prescribed or something else that's familiar, when in fact, what's not been presented often to them is sometimes the best solution. There's other examples where sometimes the best thing for the patient, it's not a particular treatment. It's not going to the doctor. It could be changing their diet, right? It can be changing their lifestyle. And so I think that just as the advisors that we know that they would help their employers become more self-insured, I think what we'll hopefully see is that more patients and more self-insured employers will see that, well, maybe the best care journey, maybe the best treatment for these kind of patients, it's not going to be a pill. It's not going to be something traditional. It is something that's based on science, and not because it's unfamiliar means that it's not based on sound science. On the contrary, right now, as we're speaking, there's so many clinical trials testing these types of therapies to see, okay, which cancers are going to be able to be addressed better with one of these kind of therapies. And I think the last time we looked, there's about 1,000 clinical trials right now testing to see, okay, which variant and which therapy in this space is the one that could help address some of these cancers. And there's so many other clinical trials we can talk about as well, where the same thing is happening. The clinical team, the medical team has got a group of patients in a clinical trial saying, okay, how can we make this therapy, or what therapy or its variant can help patients with this particular condition? So even in the last 12 months, we've seen more and more approvals of that kind. So I think things will be dramatically different in 5 to 10 years in terms of how this has become adopted. And there's even big players. One of them, everybody knows my name now because of their product. One of them has been investing a lot more in this space because they're already anticipating that, okay, in the future, they want to be ahead of the game. They want to still be dominant in terms of helping the patients.
Is this the future of medicine, of how we're going to be treated in 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, there's more than a number of experts and prominent sources that say that this area of therapies, of medicine, is what will transform healthcare. That's not our opinion. That's from others.
Well, I'm glad to know you and your solution. If somebody's interested in getting in touch to learn more, what do they need to do?
Well, the easiest way is they can go to our website. They can go to MedAdvisor.co. I think they can find us on the Granite list. We have a page there with more information. And so that's the best way because there's plenty of content we have on there. Some of it's content we've created. There's also content that is, a lot of it is from clinical trials, but that also shows a full range of different clinics so they can understand, okay, where might there be an option for them? But ultimately, that's the easiest way. And there's so much more information. We continue to create videos that are helpful for patients based on different science that is presented or becomes available. So that since most people might not have the time to look at a very long, lengthy scientific article, we try to put it into a concise format in video form. So it's easy for a patient to understand, these are the kind of questions I need to ask my doctor, or this is something I can explore with my advisor and also my physician. And we always want them to do that.
What a wonderful resource to have for anybody that gets diagnosed with an autoimmune disorder and is looking for something different besides medicine or your typical medicine. It's great to know about your solution, MedAdvisor. And Anthony, as always, thank you for being a partner on the Granite list. It's always great to have you and have your insights and education in this field. So thank you for all of our listeners. And that is another episode of the Granite List Live.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Granite List Live. Access our entire library by visiting your favorite podcast venue or subscribe on our site, thegranitelist.live.